So thank you for bearing with us. We had a little technical assistance we wanted to provide to our Routt County partners, but we would like to welcome you to our December 4th session of our CSU Meat School. And so tonight we are going to cover part 2 of processing, and we're going to cover meat cutting for different markets. So hold on here. Oops, sorry about that. Okay, so again, you know who we are, Martha Sullins and Rebecca Thistlethwaite. We are your facilitators, both online as well as offline. So any questions, please feel free to direct them to us. We still have to extend our appreciation to the Western Extension Risk Management Education Center, who has helped to finance this course and will also help us finance, I think, some additional follow-up. So here we are on week 5. As we said, we're going to be covering processing this week. Next week is part 2 of our marketing session. And so while we're going to cover meat cutting, be taking some notes, because you're going to be able to use that information as you start thinking about developing pricing models, which we're going to cover next week. So just a little housekeeping. Our files are still in Dropbox. If you have any difficulty locating either the PowerPoints or any of the other resources, please let me know. We'll make sure we get those to you. The Google group has been a little silent over Thanksgiving, but we sure hope that we can get some more discussion going before we wrap up, because we think that's just a great way to build some conversation around these issues. So for tonight, the thing that I wanted to talk about was that strategic marketing plan. And I saw I had a question from someone about the fact that this is a PDF and probably it's not fillable. So I can also upload this as a Word document if that would help, so that you can actually enter information onto it, and it'll make it a lot less painful to complete. But what would be great is if you've been struggling with, kind of starting from the top and trying to figure out what information you want to enter. If you could start with your vision and your mission statement for your meat business, that would be really helpful. And if you've seen this, if you've taken a look at this form, you can also look at what your general outcomes are for your business, and I think that'll really be helpful. On page 2 are some strategic strategies, goals, and objectives. And if you could also take a crack at those, that would be great. What I'd like to do then is if you could send that to me, that would be really helpful, because then I want to set up an appointment with Dawn and a few others of us that we can do that 30 minutes of business consulting. So if you have any more questions about that, email me separately, pop a question in the chat. But we'd really like as many people to take advantage of this as possible. Now's probably as good a time as any to start thinking long-term about how you want to build out your meat business. We've been talking about, who your target markets are, what your products are going to be for those target markets. And we're going to have a really great session next week too, where we talk about customer engagement. And so I think that'll really help you iron out the rest of this strategic marketing plan. But any more questions, please let me know. Again, all of our discussion is going to be in the chat box, or we can follow up with that Google discussion group. But, Rebecca will be there in the background, aggregating all of the questions and making sure that our presenter this evening is able to answer all of those. So we are very lucky this evening to have Bob Delmore with us from Colorado State University's Department of Animal Sciences, highly recommended by Todd Hagenbu. And he is going to do a marathon session with us on meat cutting for different markets. So with that, I am going to boot up his presentation and we'll get started. All righty. And there we go. Okay.
Okay, everybody, I appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight. It's very important that if you have questions, the format doesn't allow us to stop as we go along, but we've got 2 question sessions set up. So I'm a big fan of questions. I always start my presentations, formally or informally, with this statement, which says, if you're doing something that's totally different than what I talked about and your customers are happy with it, for God's sake, don't change anything. The things that I'm going to talk about are things that I've seen in the past. I've talked to, and I daily talk to lots of people that are doing this. We run a small university meat facility. I've worked in small facilities. I've worked in large facilities. We've done a lot of consulting over the years with people that have been doing small and large versions of what we're talking about. So what I'm going to talk about is a combination of a few nuts and bolts items that are fixed and we have to follow the rules on, and then some other general ideas of some of the things that that I've seen. So the bottom line is if you've decided that you want to do this, whether it's beef, pork, lamb, goat, you essentially have two choices. You're going to either sell the live animal to someone, and you could avail yourself of the custom exempt processing, and we'll talk about that briefly. Or you've decided that you're going to sell a little bit farther down the chain, you're going to sell sides and freezer boxes and retail cuts, and that's going to require inspection. Now, I don't want to belabor this, especially since some of this has probably already been covered, but I get a lot of questions about my neighbor is doing something a little bit different. My neighbor is, selling meat in a different way that's not following the rules. And the bottom line is there's lots of folks that do lots of different things. We're going to talk about the way that it should be done. There's folks that work on different, comfort levels. We just recommend that this is the way that the current system in this country is set up, and so we need to follow that. If we're going to use a plant that's a custom exempt plant, and I worked in one of those when I was a kid, these facilities don't have USDA inspection. And we all know that we have the opportunity in this country to take products there, and if we're going to take our product there and have it processed for our use, that's great. The idea is that it's consumed by us. If I take a steer in, that steer then is processed and it's consumed by me. And the product that's produced at that custom facility cannot be sold. It's for the owner, the immediate family, and the non-paying guests. We did a project one time at another university for the prison system, and the decision was that they were non-paying guests, and so we did some product under custom for the prisoners. In this day and age, that probably wouldn't work. The other thing that most of you know and we see is that the products that have not for sale on them are products that came out of a custom facility. And that not for sale is to remind everybody that they're not for resale. Now, if we're going to either slaughter the animal and process the animal, typically in the same facility, all meat that's going to be sold to those consumers must be slaughtered and processed in an inspected facility. So when I was going through this with the meat lab manager today, he wanted me to remind everybody that we're talking about a facility that's got a grant of inspection. That's a complicated process. If we're really gluttons for punishments, one of these nights we'll talk about a grant of inspection. This is required if you're going to sell or resell, depending on how the terminology that you're using, meat by the cut or the piece, you've got to have that inspection. If it's packaged for sale from that facility, it's got to have what we refer to as the USDA bug. Maybe bug is a bad word, and I can see that the picture there of our bug didn't come out too well. I apologize. They look really nice on the computers, and then 3 screens in, they look a little funky. So remember that the dye on there, we get that question all the time. That's a food grade vegetable dye. It's not harmful. Typically in the in the fabrication process, we would trim that off, but we would stamp the carcass, and we might stamp major cuts depending on what type of facility that we're in. Some facilities, smaller facilities, like to do that for all parts. The larger plants, actually, we almost don't even stamp them anymore because we have a little bit of a different system. It will have to have an inspection legend on the package. And again, as a reminder, we have some folks in this country that have the opportunity to move this product across state lines. Anytime that you're moving product across state lines, it must be inspected. So if you're going to set up and you have an opportunity to do this, and you're going to establish a relationship with this processor or your processor, I can't stress that it's a relationship. Um, and I understand sometimes, especially in different parts of the country right now, it's tough. We have been receiving nonstop calls asking us if we're going to go into the processing business for outside animals. The simple answer is no, not at this time. Um, we we know that there's a little bit of a shortage in different parts of both the state and the country. And so it's hard to get, quite frankly, to get on the list sometimes, to get on that kill sheet, to get animals in. What I like to suggest is that you talk to the individual and you really make it clear both to you and to them, what is it that you're trying to accomplish? Is this a one-off opportunity where you're slaughtering an animal? Or is this something that you are going to do for the next days, weeks, and months? Now, I have some friends and they do a little bit of shopping around, and I don't know that I recommend that. And they're almost kind of comparing one against the other. And some folks are very dialed in for this. So the first thing that you're going to start with is a cut sheet. And details. You've got to have the details on the cut sheet. We did a couple of lambs for somebody the other day, just because we needed some lambs for a class, and trying to get information from the folks was brutal. And so we ended up cutting them standard. But as I'll mention again in a second, once that animal's cut and once those steaks and roasts are at the thickness, there's nothing we can do. Typically, the sheets that you'll see, and I'll bring up one here in a second, are designed for family use. It's the old style version of you're slaughtering a steer or you're slaughtering a hog, and you're filling out a cut sheet. I have seen some processors that are doing a really nice job, and now they have different sheets for different styles. And so, take advantage if they've got different sheets set up. This particular sheet is one that we did 5 or 6 years ago. We did a little freezer beef project that we were working with Ardec. And so this was just a sheet that the meat lab manager, had on file. It's kind of a, very traditional cut sheet that we would use. We're going to need to move away from this, and the plants are going to need to move away from this as we start to talk about some of the different fabrication methods that you're going to want to take advantage of. Long and the short of it is, make sure that you get this information, to the processor very early. We still have problems. I remember when we were a kid, we'd go in the cooler and it's time to cut this beef, and you'd go and you try to pull the instructions and there wouldn't be any instructions. And that still happens today. The plants just will go ahead and fab it in a standard way, and you'll lose out on the opportunity. So I say be clear about the expectations. What is it that you need in the process? If this is something that you're going to be reselling, you've got to articulate that very clearly up front, because some of our folks are going to label and process things, in a little different fashion. Steak thickness, fat trim. This one gives us trouble all the time. It depends on where you are and what part of the world. I spent 9 years in California in a small area that if you left a millimeter more than 1/8 of an inch on a cut, the customers would scream and yell. Around here, if we go down less than 1/8 of an inch, or sometimes even less than 1/4 inch on beef items, our customers are screaming that we've trimmed off too much. So it really depends on where you are. So make sure that you communicate that. Again, pack size, it's not as much of a problem, but in the old days, we were always trying to put as many pieces in a package as we could. Just make it crystal clear. If you only want one steak in that package, you need to make it clear. Just as a reminder to my friends that are in this industry, there's 2 times where you can't get very much done. It's brutal to get on the schedule, and it's hard to get a hold of them. And that's hunting season and county fair season. And during that time, you're not going to get much service from these folks. Most of these folks are overcommitted, and so the coolers are full. One thing I do want to point out also is there's a really nice document that I'm holding in my hand that you can't see, but we can make it available to you, that NCBA did a few years back, and it's entitled Your Beef Breakdown Explained. And there's different versions of this out on the internet. There's one out there that talks about that processors are not stealing meat. I get this question a lot. I also realize I said 6 times. I apologize. I get this question a lot. I don't have as much meat as I started with. We have been explaining this for many, many, many years, and this may be another session that we want to do. But by the time that we slaughter that animal, And by the time that we age that animal and then we fabricate that animal all the way down into boneless cuts and package it, there's a lot less than we started with. And I'll talk a little bit more about some other factors that go into that, but it's just a fact. And I've never been in an environment where people are taking meat. I suppose it could occur, but most of the time it's just that we've got an animal that is either fat or big, and it doesn't cut as well as people thought it was going to be. You know, I thought I'd touch base just a little bit on some important things like thickness. I get in trouble because I don't cut in our facility every day. And so I was covering for the guys that were on vacation, and I was cutting steaks way thinner than they wanted. We had moved our standard up a little bit to 1.5 inches on a couple of items, and I was cutting 1.25 inches, and so then I got chewed out afterwards. There's a lot of opinion, a lot of passion in where these things should be cut. And again, my standard answer is you have to default back to what you've established that your customer base likes. There's still a lot of thin cut steaks sold in this country, not for me, but for other folks. So figure out what that is. Some of it will be figured out through trial and error, and then just make sure that you communicate that effectively. We cut pretty much everything that we fabricate at CSU. Nothing's less than 1.25 inches anymore. Virtually nothing. And many of our steak items, especially lamb chops, et cetera, are 1.5 inches and 2-inch thick. Some of the customers, you know, have an interest in selling to restaurants, and the restaurants oftentimes will use much thicker cuts. Again, it depends on the cut that you're doing. If you have the opportunity to sell, you know, ribeye steaks, they'll want a very thick cut. If you have the opportunity, I'll show you some pictures of what we call our top loin medallions. We cut all those 2 inches. If you're in the business and you're portioning for restaurants, big restaurants and chains are buying by the ounce. They're buying typically, I've just put 5 up there, 6, 8, 12, 14, and 18 ounce. Obviously, it depends on the steak. Lots of 6 and 8 ounce steaks are top sirloin steaks. Lots of 12 and 14 ounce steaks are rib and loin. And then 18 ounce steaks, et cetera, would be rib and T-bones. So variable on the cut, but something to think about depending on how big it is that you want to do, want to get. Do you want to be selling to restaurants? We've had some situations where we've got some folks now that are asking us to do some dry aging, et cetera, and we're not going to be able to cut steaks the old-fashioned way that we did just by thickness. We'll have to move into some sort of apportioning because that's the expectation that they have. And if we want to keep that business, we would have to do that. Some of the people that you would interact with would be set up for portioning, and some wouldn't be. It's not inherently difficult, but if you haven't done it, there's a lot of opportunity for error. Again, I think it's warranted just briefly on the packaging. The small plants that we're dealing with, the small plant that I'm running at the university, we use vacuum packaging. We put meat inside of a vacuum bag. Now that's different than what we call a roll stock machine, which is basically you envelop the meat and you have a nice package. The vacuum package that we put out, it's a little bit rough, but it's functionally very good. There's still a lot of folks that like paper. There's still a lot of folks that advertise paper. I would think that most people would think that vacuum packaging is preferable. There's nothing wrong with calling it cryovacking. I just don't, because cryovac is a brand name. So we have lots of different bags that we use. So if it's individual customers you're dealing with, their expectation is a vacuum package, certainly most of the time. Restaurants, their expectation is absolutely vacuum package. I don't believe that there'd be anybody that would want to take paper wrapped product, but there could be exceptions. When we make over the years, when we've had opportunities to make ground beef patties for folks like that, their expectation is to get those in the box format that they'd be familiar with. So you'd have small white boxes. And then we do what we call chub packaging. We do a lot of small chub packaging. for the ground beef. It's a very traditional package. It's very traditional at small meat shops. One of the subsequent slides, I've got a picture on there of somebody putting together chubs. So something to think about if you're talking about the packaging. If you're going to do vacuum packaging for bone-in cuts, you've got to use Bone Guard. Either Bone Guard bags where the Bone Guard material is impregnated in the bag, or you've got to add the Bone Guard. Those two pictures, one is a clear, one is kind of a wax coating. They add cost to the process. Some processors will charge additional depending on what you're going to make. And where this comes into play, I've got some steaks listed later on, the cowboy steak, or I'm not sure I can still use tomahawk steak. That may not be the appropriate term anymore. But the steak, those rib steaks with lots of bone on them, packaging those things in a small plant is very hard, and the leaker rates are very, very high. So we just need to be cognizant of this when we're dealing with the processor and what we're asking that processor to do. We've moved away from a lot of bone-in cuts, but some of them are now coming back again. So there's a lot of demand for T-bones and porterhouses in certain areas. Bone-in rib steaks are popular again. Bone-in New Yorks are popular again. Luckily, they're not that popular for us. It drives us crazy because everything that we do is frozen. And that leads me to the next problem, which is what we call leakers. Those of you that are doing this right now, those of you that are getting product, those of you that are putting product in freezers and delivering it know what leakers are. And that's when you've lost the vacuum. You've got a very small pinhole in the package and you've lost the vacuum in the package. Most of you also know about this because this is the 2 or 3 packages that you've got in the back of your freezer or the bottom of your freezer that look like heck, and they've got a lot of ice built up inside of them, and you just keep avoiding using them. They get worse and worse and worse. This is a big problem, and there's no easy way to fix this. The kids at school, they just put them in a big box and hide it from me. What we need to do is do a better job of packaging, and then when we create a leaker, we need to fix it. Unfortunately, the only way to fix it is with a vacuum machine. And so this is something that you need to be aware of. It could be an issue when you are going to distribute these products because in theory, you're not supposed to repackage. And so if there's some questions about that, we can talk about that. But it is something we need to pay attention to, especially those of you that are going to need to use every bit of that frozen shelf life. I saw that you already did labeling, so I'm going to be real quick on this. I'll include this material so that folks can refresh their memory about it. USDA requires, in most cases, not all cases, up to 8 requirements for a label. You won't have to have nutrition facts on most of these plants because you're going to be under the volume restrictions that USDA has, so that won't be an issue. You won't have ingredients because these are typically going to be single ingredient items. You do need to have a handling statement, so you're going to have to make a statement about whether the product needs to be stored fresh or frozen. And you will have to have a safe handling label. Any product that's sold raw must have a safe handling label on it. So if you're making bacon, bacon is a raw product, it must have a safe handling label on there. By the way, the government mandates this. I don't know if anybody reads it, but by God, it needs to be there. I thought I'd mention a couple of things because I think this is becoming more of an issue, certainly for the very large meat plants and meat businesses, but I did want to mention it briefly. There's a push right now on product dating, food product dating, and there's a push to go to what we call open coding or open dating. And this push is being driven by the fact that in this country we have way too much food waste. And one of the problems is, again, this is not typically people that are selling freezer beef and things like that. That's not where it's coming from, but it's coming from grocery stores where they are required and where they want to put dates on the product. And this open dating for the customer allows them to see how long they should keep this for quality. So I should have underlined that word quality right there. This is about the quality of the product. This is not safety. These dates that we have on here are driven by the best quality and to help the store figure out how long they're going to keep this for sale. The only place my wife buys meat is in the stuff that's in the far left corner that's 3 days old. because it's a lot cheaper. It's perfectly safe to use, but it's lost the color. So this open dating, or this idea of telling the customers when they should use the product by, is something that everybody's pushing, but the problem is they don't know exactly how to do it. So I just mention it because I think it's important. In the past, what we've done is something called a closed date, where we don't tell the customers how long to keep the product. And so we have lots of products that have code dates embedded in the UPCs. It's probably better to tell the customer a realistic time. And on a frozen product, there isn't a right, there isn't a wrong, but a year is kind of the standard. The problem comes on using this open dating when you pack something. Let's say I packed something last December and I've still got some of that in inventory. And I sell that now, or I sell that in January or February, and the customer sees that it was packed a year ago. Quality wise, it may be great. The packaging, hopefully, if we've done our job right, has held up. But still in their mind, that product is over a year old. Now, again, we could have another 50-minute argument about why do I have inventory that's a year, but there are situations where you're going to have some inventory on hand and you're just not going to be able to move it. So what I'm telling you to do is think about those dating systems that you have on the product. You need to have a dating system on a product anyway, because you need to be able to trace the product. In the unlikely event that you have an issue, you need to be able to trace that. So we use a combination of both open and closed. We use a Julian date, which is just simply the numeric day of the year on some of our products, so that in the unlikely event we have a problem, we can find them again. Right now, this is a question that we get all the time. Is it a requirement? And the answer is no. The federal government does not have a requirement. You do not have to put sell-by dates on products. It's a voluntary system. If you want to do this, you need to be truthful and you can't mislead them, but it is not required unless you're producing some specific products. If you have products that are over a year, you do need to, if you're going to participate in that, you do need to have the year in there if you're going to have shelf life that's over a year. Okay, we're going to change topics a little bit. And this is entitled Cutting Style. And what I mean by this is, when I was a kid, everything out of the chuck was cut into 2-inch roasts. They were about, back then, they were probably 12 inches across and about 9 inches deep, and they were huge. And people liked bone-in chuck roasts, 7-bone roasts, and we had O-bone. We had these big arm roasts that looked like dinosaurs, and people a long time ago would cook some of those. They have fallen very much out of favor. Yes, I know some of you buy 7 bones and some of you go to a local store that sells 7 bones, but by and large, they're not as popular as they used to be. And so we started boning the chuck very differently. And we did that in response to our customers and in response to what we learned about the carcass. So here's an example of something that we still do today. When I was a kid, this is how you cut a top sirloin. So on the right is a top sirloin, top block, sometimes people call it. It's a very good piece of meat. Those of you that have been through beef quality assurance training, this was the cut that precipitated all that training, because people would give injection sites in the top butt, and that left a very, they were given injection, excuse me, and the result would be, or could be, an injection site lesion in that top sirloin, very undesirable. And so what we would do is we would cut a steak that looks very much like what the steak is on the left. You can still go and find that today. The problem is there's 2 big muscles there. And the muscle on the right-hand side here, okay, this gluteus medius muscle, is cut correctly. It's cut across the grain. So that's the standard position that we take all the time, is we cut muscles across the grain so that we have muscle fibers that are very short. And so when we cook it and eat it, we're chewing on short pieces of muscle fiber, something that's more tender. This muscle over here is cut with the grain because of the way that God put the animal together. And when that thing is cut, you're cutting it with the grain. So we have a steak where one muscle of the steak is right and one muscle of the steak is wrong. And so one muscle is got a good eating experience and the other one has a poor eating experience. So I would advocate that cutting top sirloins this way is a really bad idea and results in a very inconsistent product. And so what I say is we move to a little bit more of a modern approach to cutting a top sirloin, where we actually take what we call the cap or the culotte, or some of you that have been to the Brazilian restaurants, we call that the picanha. We take that off. We remove that muscle, which is this piece right here. We remove that muscle and we cut that into steaks. And what we do is we come up with what we call culotte steaks, and they're cut across the grain. The other thing that we do is we separate out the sciatic nerve that runs right down the middle of this. That sciatic nerve runs right down the middle of that. And if you leave that in the steak, it's going to turn into, if you were sitting in front of me, you guys and gals would all be nodding, gristle. And yes, that's the gristle that's in that steak. So what we do for the customers is we take that gristle out and we make what we call baseball steaks. And so and by the way, we can do a lot of different configurations out of this, but baseball steaks is one of the very popular ones. And so we can cut that top sirloin into a much more functional product. By the way, we can also make roasts out of it. We can make half-foot roasts. We can make half-foot steaks. We can make the steaks what they call two-thirds steaks, which basically is by taking this piece and cutting it in a third and leaving half of it in two-thirds and baseball steaks out of one. You can do 100 different things out of this. Do you have a little more cutting loss than if you did it the old-fashioned way and left all this stuff in here? Of course you do. Absolutely. Would you have to price these differently? Of course you would. You'd have to pay attention to that. But this is what I would say is that people need to be following are some of these new styles that we have, and the top sirloin is a really good example. This is not hard to learn. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of videos out on the internet that show people how to do this. If the person that you're working with, the processor, isn't familiar with how to do that, they can learn really easy. We learned a few years back, well, a long time ago, and it's the only way we fabricate today. Now, sometimes people want to say, well, what if I don't want to make retail cuts? And, is it a better opportunity for me to do primal cuts and sell them to restaurants? Should I try to, develop a relationship with my local restaurant and sell strip loins to them? Depends. There are people that buy strip loins at restaurant level and cut, but they're also having problems with getting people to do that work. If they have a chef and that chef is doing the lion's share of the work in that restaurant, and they've just got some really, entry-level people that are working also there, cutting steaks is not something they know how to do, which is why, the Syscos of the world have expanded all of their operations these last 5 years to include huge meat cutting operations, because the customers that they deal with need those steaks cut. But it's a creative opportunity. If you have a local person there that's interested in some of your product, maybe you come up with a solution and you cut some primals that are set up for dry aging. And I'll talk about those if we get some time right at the end. You cut some bone-in things, so a bone-in rib or a bone-in short loin. And we leave all the bone and all the fat on there, and that individual takes it and does some dry aging with it. Maybe they've got a dry aging case in their restaurant. So I don't think this is the best way to do it. It could be an opportunity. Again, if you're going to do that, make sure that the person that you're working with can package bone-in primals like ribs, etc. They take a decent sized vacuum machine. They take a bone-in bag. Most of them would have a pretty good sized machine, but some folks that are still in the beginnings, they may have a very small machine. So if everything else has bored you, and if you're counting the minutes till Bob is done, this is the part that you need to pay attention to. So this is the most important part of the process. This is the thing that I spend a ridiculous amount of time talking to folks about still to this day. And by the way, it's small folks, it's large folks, it's not people, they're businesses and everything in between. This idea of what your cutout is. So when we talk about the cutout, we talk about what we're going to do with that beef carcass. If it was in a large plant, if I was over in Greeley, they'd be talking about what they're going to do with thousands of a particular type of carcass every day. And it's basically setting a plan for that type of carcass. And it's a matter of whether we're going to have bone-in or boneless cuts. It depends on how big the carcass is. We have a very specific plan for that carcass. Now, if you're processing 10 steers a year, no, you're not going to have a different plan for each one of your animals. But I will tell you, you need to understand what your cutting style and your product base, your finished product, what it's going to yield for you. Those customer specifications are going to dictate that. So the question that people ask me all the day, they say, can you just send me what a standard cutout would look like? And I say, no, there is no standard cutout. Okay? It's like saying, how do you get along with your spouse? There's no standard way, right? There's certain things you better do. There's certain things you better not do. And this one is hard. So what you should do if you have the opportunity is you should figure out exactly how much product you're getting by going and weighing all those products. Because if you decide that you want, or your customers want, a very boneless cutting style, because your customers are not interested in bones, they don't want soup bones, they don't want bone-in cuts, their lifestyle doesn't, interest that, then that means that you're going to have less meat in that cutout. If you're doing grass-fed versus grain finished, or grass-fed finished versus grain finished, if you're finishing on grain, you're going to be trimming fat and you're going to be removing that. When we would do grass-fed in California, there were years where we had rain. And so those carcasses were phenomenal. 700-800 pound carcasses, they were great. There were years where we had 400 and 500 pound carcasses because we didn't have moisture. So that's going to affect our cutout. The amount of boneless cuts that you have is going to affect your cutout. When you age the product's going to affect your cutout. Because remember, when that carcass is hanging in there, it's losing water. And in some situations, we can lose 7, 8, 9, 10, 12% moisture out of those carcasses. So you put 100 pounds into the cooler and you age it, you don't get 100 pounds out. So if you have the opportunity to work with the processor and basically do a full-blown cutout, you know what you started with, you know what you ended with, and all of the individual weights, that's the best way to do it. I've got friends that what they do right now, because there's no way for them to get that information, they just do it themselves. They bought a scale, they bring the beef home, and they do a yield test on every single animal. And this particular individual is really data-driven, so he's got spreadsheets for each one of his animals so that he can understand over time what's going on. That's also going to help long-term for pricing. If you're going to sell these products, you've got this product, you've picked it up. I had a picture of a basement with a freezer in it because you can't take it home and put it in the basement. I know that people are doing that, but you've got to, if you're going to distribute this yourself, you've got to get a retail food establishment license. In the state of Colorado, you type that in, takes you to their website. Depending on what county you're in, you're either going to go to the individual county or you're going to go to the Department of Public Health and Environment, and you're going to fill out a really long checklist that's going to make you angry, like paying taxes angry. I can't do anything about that. It's the way that the rules are written. You cannot distribute these products out of your home. Typically, anything that's associated with a residential facility, they will not allow you to work out of. You need to work with someone that has a freezer that you can distribute these products out of. So we can talk about a little bit of this on the questions if you have. I don't want to spend too much time on getting around this because that's not really what our objective is, but I can provide a couple of suggestions of what I've seen people do in the past to make this a little bit more palatable. All right, so that brings us, we're not too bad on time, that brings us to our first stopping point for questions. Now maybe it's been so bad there are no questions,
All right. Go ahead and pop your questions into the chat box. I will start, Bob. I looked up the retail food code stuff on the web, and I didn't think it was that onerous. I thought you could just get away with having, a garage with a nice deep freezer in it and keep everything labeled and segregated
If you look at
to store meat.
well, yeah, I guess onerous is in the eye of the beholder. So there's a process in the state of Colorado. You have to go down the list and you have to check all the boxes. So things like cleanable floor, cleanable wall, sealed doors. The other problem that you're going to have is as soon as you get a leaker, you're going to want to do something with that leaker. And if you are going to try to fix that leaker, then you're going to have a hand wash sink. So it's not that it's not doable. I just point out that it needs to be, following the rules. Each state's going to be different. Each county is going to be different. Some people, I have seen folks, they have a room that they've dedicated on the facility. It's got a concrete floor and it's got freezers in it. That's perfectly acceptable. But what you can't have is you can't have a freezer in a cattle barn and you're taking meat in and out of that freezer and you say, well, it's sealed. Long term, that will get you in trouble.
Yeah. When we used to farm in California, they would come out once a year and inspect our freezers. And we had, really nice Sears low temperature freezers in an outbuilding with a concrete floor. And we had an inventory checklist, and we would move product in first in, first out. Just kept track of all the inventory, but they mainly were concerned about like rodent activity and product segregation and working freezers. So do you think
right? So you've talked about half the things on the list. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so some of the things that are on that list wouldn't be applicable. You're not going to need a hood because you're not cooking foods. You're not going to need a sneeze guard on your salad bar because you're not doing a salad bar. But what I'm saying is it's a process, and so I'm not trying to belabor it. It's just that it's something that people have to be aware of.
And since I don't live in Colorado, how accessible are cold storage facilities where you can just rent by the pallet space? Is that something that's a thing in Colorado?
Sure, the big ones, absolutely. But typically the questions that we get is folks that are at ranch level, and it's really not practical, and they're 80 miles, 100 miles, 200 miles away, and they want to be able to distribute product, and that's one additional process that they have to go through, to put a freezer in there. The big ones are absolutely, there's lots of cold storage facilities, but there's fewer ones that are directed towards a little bit smaller process.
All right, so we do have a couple questions from our audience. Tony asks, can you explain about whether or not, or to what extent, processors can use or market byproducts such as bones, fats, and organ meats? I have a strong demand for broth bones, marrow bones, and dog bones. How much bones should I expect to get back from the processor? His question's kind of long. You can see it in the chat, but can you talk about some of those byproducts?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's an area that I will say that I'm still trying to figure out exactly what the best answer is. But you hit it in your question. What should I expect? So if somebody tells me, if I was fabricating right now and I just am doing the standard fabrication, we'd be getting rid of all the bones unless he or she said to me, hey, I've got an opportunity here. I want to save bones. I want you to cut all the marrow bones that I can. I need you to save all the bones, get them into small pieces. We did a project in California for a lamb group. And this particular customer, she could sell every bone off the carcass. And so we would split every single bone that we had. We did not throw a single bone in the bone can. We would split them. She had a requirement on how long they had to be. And so we would pack those bones, and she took them all. It was phenomenal. So this is where you need to figure out ahead of time what it is that you want to save. You don't want to just save me every single bone, because then you're going to get trash bags full of bones and you're not going to be able to pack them. But I think that's something that people could look at. What I don't know the answer is, what the next question is going to be, is that how do we start making the broth and taking advantage of this? I think that's a little more complicated, but I do think it's a good opportunity. So you say there's also demand for liver, heart, and kidney. Great. My guess is it's for pet food, but that's great. If you can do it, absolutely. That would be the normal part of the process. We would not expect in a small plant, typically they are not expecting to keep that. So if I worked with the JBSs or the very big plants, and I've got 200 or 300 or 400 being killed every week, that drop, they're expecting to keep all that as part of their drop credit. But most of the time, in my experience with the small plants, they would be very happy to package those. They put them in a bag. Usually it's a simple packaging, and they would freeze those. The only caveat I'll say is just be aware of what the rules are for where you are. I'm not endorsing or I'm not endorsing raw pet food, et cetera. We do have people that call us all the time, and it's really good until they stop coming. So the only problem is it's really good for a while. I asked for the liver, but really smallest pack. Well, I think on the question on packaged, I think you just need to explain, because I will tell you historically, my answer to your last question there is why would be very relatively small amount is packaged is because nobody would want it. But we're in a little bit different time now. And some of you all of you are very entrepreneurial. And so there are opportunities for that. Absolutely. I think the other thing is throwing it away is horrendous. It's just that when I poll the students in class, 2 of them have eaten liver in the last 6 months, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if you are paying for cold storage or sitting on inventory, it's never fun to sit on a lot of this inventory for long, and organs don't freeze particularly well. So you should make sure you have a market for this stuff before you start asking for all of it back.
Yep. And the other thing I'll say on the heart is that in the inspection process, we have to cut the heart in half. And so typically we would trim a lot on heart, and we would trim off a lot of fat. But you might be able to talk about that. Planning to offer retail meat.
All right. So should we go to the next question? I'll
Sure.
read it to the group.
Yeah, please.
Brian asks, as a new processor, yay, Brian, we love new processors. I am planning to offer retail using local grass-fed beef, lamb, and pastured pork. I plan to use USDA inspected meat from other plants processed through my custom exempt plant. So he's going to do what's called retail exempt. I was planning to work under the retail exemption to the point where I have enough volume to take the next step. Once you start wholesaling past a certain amount, $75,000 a year, then you have to become USDA. Any landmines to worry about? What do you think there, Bob?
So Rebecca just mentioned that the dollar amount. It exists, so you just need to be cognizant of it. I know lots of people who push that, which is good. The only landmine is if you make the decision to go forward, it's complicated. We're going through that right this minute. So we've been operating a retail exempt facility. We brought in inspected product, we fabricated product, and we've been selling product direct to customers for many, 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 many years. Now we're in the process of moving 100% under inspection. It's more complicated, but it's a different business. And so if you want and are ready for that next step, you take it. What you do though is you find yourself somebody that is good to kind of give you some ideas of how to move forward in this. We can talk a little bit offline. That isn't the USDA inspector, with no disrespect to them. They're not in the business of telling you how to do the business. The biggest problem that we have right now and that people have on a daily basis, to be really candid, is paperwork, because you just have to make sure that you have a good, tight system in place to have the paperwork done. And for us the other day, the student didn't show up at 7 o'clock to do pre-op like they were supposed to. And so we didn't have pre-op done that day. And so then you get what's called a non-compliance record. So we can talk a little bit more offline about that, but we are certainly, I echo Rebecca's comments. We're glad you're getting in the business.
Yeah. And, you know, if you're just doing fresh cuts, the HACCP plans that you'll have to develop are pretty straightforward. It's when you're doing the more further processed products like smoke product or cured products that it can get a little bit more complicated. There are HACCP consultants out there. You can also take a course and learn how to do it yourself. And I will put in a plug for USCA FSIS now has an outreach program through, they have a lot of acronyms. It's EIAOs, and I'm not exactly sure what that stands for. Enforcement, blah, blah, blah.
Investigation. Well, now you got me.
Yeah, and
investigation and
you
analysis.
think you don't want to invite those people into your facility because you think that they are going to come and do an enforcement action, but they now have to dedicate 25% of their time to outreach. And this is the perfect type of project that they like to work on. And so even though technically they're not supposed to provide consulting, helping new plants come under inspection is one of the things they're best suited for. So feel free to ask for their advice because that's really what they're there for. Great question. So Tony asks, is there added expense for processor to cut and package a majority of good bones, organs, etc., above and beyond their standard processing costs?
Yeah, the simple answer is yeah, absolutely. And you know, in the old days, we would take those bones and we just throw them in a poly bag. They would not be vacuum packaged. We would not go through that effort. So that's a great question, and there isn't a standard, but yes, there is an additional cost. And that's where I think back to conversation, details. Let that individual, him or her, understand what it is that you want so that everybody up front knows what the costs are going to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if you want smaller bones, that's obviously more cuts. As Bob was saying, if you are leaving bone in your cuts, which is great, get value out of your bones, but they will have to put a bone guard in there. He also asks, is there additional expense, time, materials for the processor to package more small steaks, like you were describing, the culottes versus like a traditional top sirloin?
Absolutely, and you've hit the challenge point. So boning the chuck is the single most difficult part of the carcass to bone. We can teach the kids that we do every day to bone everything else, but the chuck is the absolute hardest part. And so for those that are very familiar with pulling a chuck roll and pulling a clod and pulling a flat iron and the, you know, serratus venturalis and all the different cuts that are out of the chuck that the beef industry has been working on for the last 15 years, yes, it takes time. It also changes the yield substantially. So the answer is it does, and you need to visit with that individual up front. What I like to recommend is maybe you step into that process. So pulling the flat iron takes a little bit of effort. You pull the chuck roll, you make boneless chuck roasts out of the chuck roll. You pull the clod, you make boneless chuck roasts out of those, and you have the flat iron, and maybe everything else goes into trim. And then maybe, you know, you get them up to speed, you know, as their system, you know, works forward. We tend to fab the chuck as many things as we can, but there's some times where we just don't have the time. And so I'll tell you, last week we were busy. We didn't pull all those Denver steaks. We just didn't. And I don't know whether it's right or whether it's wrong. It's just a matter of we didn't. So it's a very good question, and it's something that you need to visit with that individual up front. Can't get any of those things after it's done.
I will say on the NPAN YouTube channel, we have a video of breaking down the chuck in a way to maximize the value of that chuck for the producer, not necessarily for the processor. More labor is obviously not necessarily maximizing the value for the processor, but if you're a good customer for a processor and you're a partner with them for the long term, and you're going to bring them a decent number of animals over the year, as you build that relationship, they'll be more and more likely to do those specialty cuts for you and help you make more money because they want to keep you as a customer. So But if you just go in with one animal here and there and you want to get super fancy, you're going to be a thorn in their side. Right, Bob?
Well, I mean, I think it's a good point. That's where the relationship opportunity is. They're in business just, like everybody else is. It's getting more common, but in the plants, we bone on the rail so that we use gravity to help us with a lot of things. But some plants don't have that opportunity. They have to table bone all those items. And it can be done, but it takes a little bit more difficulty. And so it's much different if you fabricate a yield grade 3 fed beef animal that's been dry aged for 28 days and you try to bone that chuck than you do a grass fed animal that's 3 days post-mortem. One is really tough to fabricate. The other one is very easy to fabricate. And so, it depends on what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Brian has said, thank you for that conversation. He's the one who wants to go from retail exempt to USDA, and he will try to take you up on that offer to talk offline about that. And then last question from Tony is, what are various ways to fabricate the round? Seems like one of the most difficult primals to turn into valuable, desirable cuts.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt. Historically, that cut has been, primarily roasting cuts. As Rebecca said, there's a tremendous number of videos. This is one of the things, wherever your political bent falls down, about NCBA and all of the associations. They do a phenomenal job of putting that information out there for everybody to utilize. So there's a variety of ways that you can upgrade, for lack of a better word, some of the items. So things like the knuckle, sometimes we call it the sirloin tip or the tip. There's some steaks that you can capture out of there, and there's some ways to pull some of the connective tissue and turn those roasts into something a little more desirable. The top round is really a good cut, and there's some videos out there that talk about how you can steak those, and you could come into some steaks. They're not going to eat the same way that a rib steak is going to eat, but there's benefit in there. I'll talk about this later, but the one thing that I would be careful about on the rounds is I got a lot of folks now that are making jerky out of fed rounds. That's fine, but it's going to be a very greasy jerky. So you just have to be aware of that. Most of the jerky that we would, process in this country would be out of cow rounds because they're lean. And so in one of the models, we have people that are taking the tops, even the eyes and the bottoms, and they're trying to make jerky out of it. There's a lot of intermuscular fat. And there's a lot of marbling. So you just got to be careful of that. You're going to have jerky that's a little greasy. You just need to be aware of that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And a lot of people are interested in those value-added products, but sometimes they should be coming from your cull cows or, the more appropriate animals, the leaner animals, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Are you ready to dive back into the next section?
You betcha.
Okay. So Bob is going to continue. Again, if you have a question that comes into your mind, pop it in the chat and we will get to it at the end of the next hour.
What's that? Okay, it should be good.
Anyway.
Okay. So get a lot of calls. And if you call the university or you come by the university, we're happy to visit. And people want to say, they ask the question, well, how can I make this work? And again, I think there's probably a couple of folks on there that, are raising other species. We're focusing on beef. I guess we tend to focus on beef because there's a lot of examples for beef. All the principles that we're talking about for beef are applicable to the other species. The cutting schemes for the other species are a little more straightforward. Maybe the exception to that is goat, where we, in some ways, are still kind of developing our system in the U.S. For that. So I apologize if I left you out if you're doing some lambs, and we can talk about that later, or hogs. But there's basically 3 ways that people are doing this, and we've tried all 3 ways from a university standpoint of selling these, and I've talked to people that do all 3. So the first one is you fabricate every single solitary cut that you can possibly think of. You fab everything out of the chuck that you can possibly keep, everything out of the round, and every roast that you can possibly keep, and you make ground beef. So you have a lot of steaks, you have a huge amount of roasts, and you have a lot of ground beef to sell. The other model that I worked with a company in California, it's a big company, and that was the way that they started. They started by saving everything. And then their system, they wanted to get bigger and they wanted to be a little more streamlined. And rather than have inventory of, a handful of Denver steaks, they wanted to focus on premium steaks or steaks out of the ribs, steaks out of the loin, the middle meats, and they ground the rest of the animal. And so their system, they built their system on moving a lot of ground material. And yeah, some of that ground material probably could have been upgraded, but they made a business decision that they were going to focus on those premium steaks, getting the most that they could get for those, and then selling a lot of ground beef. And the one that we have several folks that have come and talked to me about is a system where they save some cuts, they save a lot of ground beef, steaks and roasts, but they save certain subprimals, and most of those are out of the round to try to manufacture into jerky. And so I think there's no right, there's no wrong. It really depends on kind of what you're into. If you're a person who wants to spend a lot of time on this, I have a friend in California, him and his wife are really into this. And so their customers are very loyal to them, and they're spending a lot of time on doing it #1 style, and that works great for them. The other company that I talked about in California that's a little bit bigger, there's no way that they can spend all that time with all those inventory items. So they're moving to the #2 style. I have some friends here that have moved to the #3 style. The only problem is the jerky quality, and then of course you've got to have a manufacturer, a processor that has the capacity to manufacture that jerky, or snack sticks, or whatever else that you want. It's harder to find those folks. It takes a little more skill set. There's some of them out there that do a really good job. These are just some lists that I put in there because a lot of times people are asking questions about, the flat iron or the clawed heart or the chuck roll and different things. The ranch steak came up. Some parts of the country, they'll call it a pub steak. These are good cuts that we can, take out. And there's lots of really good information that's out there that you can borrow from these big companies. So this is one that I borrowed from a really big company because it reminds us that clawed heart, you could pull that out of the shoulder clawed, and that makes a nice big old roast for a carving station. So you could roast that and basically, do an event where you're doing a carving station out of there, and that's a good idea. So just a couple of examples of some things that we would, suggest that people think about. The Terrace Major, we don't usually refer to it as by that name, but the Terrace Major, everybody loves that muscle right now. It's out of the chuck. It's a really nice portion. In fact, we just had a big meat science event in June, and we served that to 1,000 people. People loved that. A couple of things we already touched on: the flat iron. That's a standard. People expect that. People want that. The Terrace Major, that's one that they expect and want. So I would suggest that if you're doing that, you consider that. The cowboy ribeye, people like it. It's either thick cut or it has some bone. You'll see the tomahawk steak that'll have a lot longer bone on there, similar to that. Just make sure that you can handle the packaging on that. Same thing on the cowboy ribeye. When everybody wants us to make ribeyes with bone on them, it's hard to package for frozen. So just be aware of that. On the loin, bone-in strip loins are popular again. So that's not a rib bone, that's a transverse process. That's the bone that's down the middle if you're going to keep a T-bone. So bone-in strip loins are popular again. Regular strip steaks, of course. I always put this picture in because usually there's a question on this steak right here. So this steak is called a vein steak. This comes out of the last third of the loin as it approaches the back end of the animal. And that's where the gluteus medius, or the top sirloin muscle, goes over the top of the longissimus muscle. So we're not getting too technical here, but this is the longissimus muscle here. And then this little piece right here is a piece of the gluteus medius. Anytime we have two muscles together, we have connective tissue separating those two muscles, so that connective tissue in there gets chewy, and that's considered a negative. So just remember on those steaks that those aren't going to be viewed as the premium steak. If you buy those in a grocery store, that's why they're buried underneath the other steaks. One thing that we don't cut these steaks anymore because the animals that we process are huge. The other day, I don't think there was anything lighter than 1,700 pounds. They were huge. And so if we cut steaks out of that decent thickness, they'd weigh too much. And so what we do is we do the new cutting style, and we make the medallions. So we cut those in half. We cut ours, this particular picture is an older picture of ours. We cut ours a lot thicker, every bit of 1.5 inches, and the customers absolutely love that. So that's that style again, that new modern style, top loin medallions, very easy to cut. Anybody can learn how to cut those. And for those of you that are in Colorado, this is what Dallas Horton has been talking about all these years about why don't we just cut it in half. And it took us a long time to figure out the customers would be okay with doing that, because meatheads take a long time to learn things. If you're going to sell tenderloins, you got to sell them. Customers are expecting them to be what we call denuded, all the way down, all the silver skin removed on the tenderloin. I hate to do that because it just kills the yield, but the customers expect that. Just remember also, you're going to have a tail over here. You can't make a steak out of that, but there's a lot of different things that you can do. Sometimes we just sell them as tenderloin tails, and you can grill them up. They're not super pretty, but they're very, very tender. Skirt steaks, don't make the mistakes that people do by leaving the skirt steaks on the carcass to age it. Pull the skirt steaks off first, both the inside and the outside, and don't get too much caught up in the web stuff that says that one is substantially, better than the other. Yeah, one's slightly better than the other. The inside skirt steak is slightly better than the outside skirt steak, but they're both great. Customers love them. Prices are high. We pull them all the day after we slaughter them, and we get them in a package because they don't need that much aging. And anytime the kids forget and leave them on the carcass, that's when we lose our mind because they dry out very, very quickly. Had to put the hanger steak in because the chefs talk about the hanger steak. Drives me crazy. Yes, it's a nice steak. It's part of the diaphragm. It sits in the middle of the carcass. And so when we split the carcass, if we aren't thinking about that and actually move it to one side or the other, we'll usually just chop it in half. There's enough of a demand now that we're starting to pull them. The big plants are all pulling them because customers want them. It's very, very small and has a lot of connective tissue that runs down the middle of it, but the rest of it does have a tremendous amount of flavor. So this is one where Rebecca said, being a thorn in the side, don't run over there with day one expecting, a hanger steak that's weighing 5 pounds. You're not going to get that. But as you develop the relationship, you could talk to them as if they're doing the slaughtering and the fabricating, then you could talk to them about how to keep the hanger steak. We also call this, in the old days, we called it the hanging tender. Now we call it the hanger steak. Let's just talk a second about ground beef. You're going to have a lot of ground beef. You're going to have every bit of half of that carcass is going to be in ground beef, and it can be above 50% depending on how you're fabricating. The question becomes, how do you sell it and at what fat content? You've got to be able to move the ground beef. So whatever system you build, you've got to be able to sell the ground beef. I will tell you, this is where we struggle. We do not do a good job of selling ground beef, and so we end up selling ground beef cheaper than we should, and that hurts us overall. Our customer base likes 80-20 and 90-10, and they still buy more 80-20 than they do 90-10, but that's our customer base. The retail stores, all you have to do is go in there on any daily basis, and you still see there's a lot of us buying 70-30 ground beef, a lot of 85-15, and there's people that have never had anything fatter than 96-4. That's basically as lean as we possibly can make. Just remember that the small processors don't typically have good systems for sorting and testing for ground beef. So it's a little bit harder. Most of us are doing a visual. Most of us small processors are putting ground beef in chubs, just like this particular picture. Some plants, if they aren't set up for this, they got a vacuum machine, they're just putting 1 pound in a vacuum bag and making it flat. that works out great. Both of those systems are very good systems, and I have no problem with either one of those. Again, I've put a list here of steaks that you should also be thinking about out of the loin primarily. You can take a look at this later on. Porterhouse, again, remember, if you cut porterhouse and T-bones, then you can't cut strip steaks. Most of the plants, even the small plants, we need to do either or, because we're going to pull that tenderloin in the case of making New York's. We're going to pull that tenderloin as a full tenderloin, and then we're going to cut it, and then we're going to bone out the rest of that and cut those strip steaks. If you want T-bones and porterhouse, we can cut those. That's fine, but you can't have the other. So you can't have both. We already talked about that vein steak up there. Club steak, I just thought I'd mention it because, again, that's, people ask these questions all the time. The club steak is that last steak from the loin that has the rib bone, because we rib that carcass between the 12th and 13th rib. So we leave one rib on that hind quarter, and you get one steak with a bone on it from that back end there. It's, not very common anymore. So you're not going to get 5 of those from the carcass. We talked a little bit about the top butt. Tremendous opportunity here to do lots of different things. We save every single culotte, We take that cap off. We don't trim any of the fat off. The Brazilians are great. They buy them all the time, and they want every bit of fat on there. It's a phenomenal cut. Flap meat. This is a funny, we name things horrendous names in our industry. We need to change this because flap is just a ridiculous name. But we sell every bit of flap meat that comes off the bottom of the loin, and it's probably, on a typical beef carcass, it's probably almost 10 pounds on a side. It's a lot. And when the prices of skirt steaks are getting pretty high, customers will buy this. Tri-tip, you obviously need to be saving the tri-tip if you're anywhere in the western part of the country, but tri-tip is getting very, very popular. So we save the tri-tips from everything. So just some things to think about on that list out of the sirloin and the loin. Just for a couple of minutes as a reminder, as we're heading into a few other kind of pieces of material here. Pork carcasses, by tradition, have skin on them. And some of the small plants have a machine where they can produce skin on pork carcasses, but many, 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 many don't. And so they skin. So some of you, if you're selling pigs, you may not even have the opportunity to get any skin on items. And that's okay, because we take a lot of the skin off anyway. We have our traditional break points, or our traditional cuts, the leg loin, the belly, and the picnic shoulder and the Boston butt. Those are very standard cuts break points that we still make today. So it's kind of a good review. If you're going back in and you haven't done this in a while and you're dealing with the processor, take a look at your book or take a look at the web and, think about some of those things as you're going forward. Same thing on the lamb. It's even easier. The kids in class can't seem to remember these though. Leg loin, we'll either call them rack or ribs, but most of the time we'll use the term rack. And the shoulder. Remember on these sheep, we can fabricate the leg a bunch of different ways, no problem. Loin and the rack, we only make French racks. None of our customers want any chops out of the rack. They all love a French rack. So every rack that we produce is a French rack. Customers absolutely love it. It's not that hard to fabricate. Shoulder is brutal. The shoulder is very fat. And so it's a hard one to market. You got to come up with some creative solutions. There's some boneless roasts that we can make out of that. Breast and shank, all the shanks are really easy to sell. The breast is harder, so usually we just do some trim on that. And then on the beef animal, again, you've got your traditional, I keep using the word wholesale cuts. Primal cuts is a better term. I'm just older, and so we use that term wholesale cut. But primal cuts, those are the primals that you're going to be dealing with, the round and the loin. Remember, you have 2 parts to the loin. You have the sirloin and you have the short loin. Let me bring the marker over here. So you have the sirloin and you have the short loin. The whole thing together is the full loin, the rib, the chuck, the shank, the brisket, the plate, and the flank. And I didn't spend a lot of time on the plate. There are some short rib opportunities that we can get out of the plate and out of the shank, and some of the customers do really enjoy those. They're not that hard to cut, but some of the smaller plants aren't going to be used to cutting those, so we could come up some different ways for that. We can talk about this a little bit more in some of the questions, the way we fabricate these briskets now. We don't follow this traditional break point anymore because that deep pectoral muscle goes up a little higher. And so we'll actually go up a little bit higher and get more of that brisket that used to reside on that plate. And that's because briskets are valuable. Briskets are absolutely valuable. Same thing when we're peeling down the tri-tip, we make sure that we get the tip of the tri-tip. And those are some nuanced things that we can work with the processor over time. I thought I'd just mention this because as you're going through your cut list and as you're thinking about what you're going to do or what that processor is going to do for you, these are the principles that we follow. And they work really well. And I'm not going to read every one of them, but everything that we do is across the grain. Anytime that we're doing anything where we're cutting something with the grain, we're making a mistake. And so if we've got a situation where someone is cutting steaks, I'll give you the best example, tri-tip steaks. If you cut tri-tip steaks incorrectly and you cut them with the grain, they are a horrible eating experience. And that's done just by, making a mistake. The young man that was cutting meals at the Angus convention the other day was cutting this incorrectly. And of course, we were there and we had to gently explain to that individual why he was doing this wrong. And it was just a terrible eating experience. So these principles are important. This is how we've developed all these cuts over the years. And these are, they're kind of time tested and they work very well. For some of you that are really into, looking at names and thinking about how you could label things different in the marketing aspect of things, I just mentioned for a second that we do have something that's been around for a long time. It's been reborn and died and now come back a little bit better. In fact, I was just on the site as I was preparing for this. So the Uniform Retail Meat Identification Standards, or URMIS, they have a new system that you can get on there. They have a lot of names. If you're also if you happen to be setting up the barcoding for a plant, the gentleman that was talking about their plant, they've got all the information for setting up the barcoding for the different cuts. You can take a look at that because it helps us to be uniform. And in our industry, we're terrible about this. Flap meat, lifter meat, different terms that we use and become standard, but they have no really clear identification. If we're labeling a steak or we're labeling any item, we should first always start with the species. Then we go to the primal, sometimes the subprimal or the bone, and then the particular cut. So if we're talking about a beef, chuck, shoulder clawed steak, we put those descriptors there so that the customer can look at that label and figure out exactly where that's coming from. This is also good for those of you that have got kids that are doing 4-H or FFA, meat identification. You can go into the store and you can work on this with them. And so they should be able to call all those off. The other thing is, we're way off topic now, but if you're 4-H and FFA kids, they'll also tell you the cooking method. Just a couple of seconds on fat trim. You got to figure out what your customer base wants. So we have a term that we call commodity trim. So we cooked 1,200 pounds of brisket, and we did that for Ag Day. And we weren't paying real good attention to the plants sent us commodity trim. So we had briskets that had more than 1/4 of an inch, in some places 1/2 inch or more, standard trim that it comes right off the line. That didn't work well for that because when we cooked that product, it was juicy as heck, but we had a tremendous amount of trim loss that we had to deal with on the finished product. So sometimes you need to kind of understand between you and the processor what it is that you need. Some things you can handle a commodity trim on and you can just leave it that way, or a little bit more than 1/4 inch is not going to be a problem. But there's certain things that you need an 1/8 inch trim. Strip steaks, you need to trim those down. Nobody's going to want those with half an inch of fat on it. It's not going to be acceptable. Easy there, Bob. You also get a term where we called peeled. In the case of the beef knuckle there, I got a picture of those. We'll call it peeled or denuded are two phrases that we use where we'll peel that cap off of that. This is where I was talking about this little piece of the cap here is actually part of the tri-tip. So that's why we, in most cases now, remove that ahead of time with the tri-tip. But we trim the rest of this off, or we peel that knuckle. Or we peel and denude and remove all of the silver skin from something like the tenderloin. These are good terms for you to think about, so that when you're talking with that person and they're asking you, do you want that knuckle peeled? Yes, you probably do. Or do you want that membrane, everything on that tenderloin removed? Yeah, you probably do. But it's also going to affect what? It's going to affect your yield. So you just need to think about what it is that you're selling. Your customer is not going to want a steak. This is your most expensive steak that you can sell. This is the most tender muscle in the body. And so it needs to be presented as such. And so we'll peel most of those. I think Jen talked about this, but I just want to remind you that there's two factors that go into grading beef. One is marbling, the other is maturity, and what we call physiological maturity. It's not how old the animal was. In our system in the United States, we use physiological maturity. If some of the audience is old enough to remember a guy named Jack LaLanne, the guy was 90 years old and still swimming across the ocean and things like that. His body was very, 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 very young. And then there's others of us who are already feeling our age. Physiological indicators, those buttons right here on the end of the feather bones, are what tells us how old this carcass is. And we don't have an individual animal identification system in here. So even if you take this in, now remember, most of you aren't going to grade animals, but it is a good idea to take a look at how old that carcass looks. Is it A, maturity? And what I mean by A, maturity is it less than 30 months of age? Now, some of you are going to have products that are going to be above 30 months of age, and that's perfectly okay. And most of you are probably not going to have a situation where you can get products graded. But I think it is helpful to kind of understand the principles on this. Now, remember, you can't just take this grading system and apply it yourself. That's against the law. You just can't go in there and say, well, I'm going to grade it. You can't do that. But it is helpful to remember, that marbling has a lot of value. Now, in a grass-fed, grass-finished system, marbling for many is not a primary factor, and that's okay. It's not a matter of right or wrong. It's a matter of a different product, and some of those are going to be down here. But you do have some folks that have some genetics and have some irrigated pasture that they'll get some smalls and maybe even a little bit closer in the modest category of that marbling. But the eating experience marbling is important in the eating experience, and marbling covers a multitude of sins, if you will. Aging. I'm going to spend a couple minutes on aging. Get a lot of questions on aging. Two methods of aging beef. So, okay, first of all, why do we age beef? We age beef because it improves tenderness. Sometimes if we're in a relaxed setting, we'll talk about that it's controlled rotting. And that's what it is. You're aging the product and you're breaking down certain structures of the meat, certain specific proteins that you're breaking down. And you're giving yourself a texture and in some cases a flavor that people are very used to. It is a natural process. When people ask me, what do we add to the process during aging? We don't add anything. We use the enzymes that are present in the meat and we just tweak the system, if you will. And there's two types. There's wet aging and there's dry aging. And we'll talk about those briefly. The other thing that's beneficial is you do get some flavors. You get an oxidized flavor. You get a change in the flavor of the fat. You do get a concentration of a little bit of the sugars that are in meat, and you do get a concentration on those fats, and people like that. And there's actually some people that are imparting some of their own flavors. They're actually using some inoculums and basically putting on a particular type of mold on that product. And so there's a lot of opportunities downstream for people to manipulate the system and come up with some really creative solutions. Wet aging, well, how about if I start with the dry aging, which would have been the historical way? We would take the carcass and we would hold that entire carcass under refrigeration. It's a great method. It's really easy. You just hang it in there. It definitely is now more of an artisan approach. It's an open air, so there's no packaging. It's in an environment where we sometimes control the environment. Sometimes we don't. I'll talk about that a little bit. But it does have some negatives, and I'll talk about those negatives. In the 60s, we started doing what we call wet aging, which is we've cut those, in the case of this one here, which I would guess is a short loin, excuse me, a strip loin. We would put this strip loin in a bag. We would seal that bag, take the air out first, and then seal that bag. And then we would hold that product under refrigeration throughout the entire aging process. And this is the standard method in our industry today. The overwhelming majority is absolutely wet aged. You put it in a bag, you draw a vacuum. Bone in or boneless, you can wet age either one. Has to be under refrigeration, and it cannot be frozen. You cannot age meat frozen. It does not work. So if you folks are in front of me, we'd be reminding each other right now, what temperature does meat freeze? The answer is 28 degrees Fahrenheit. So this particular slide said we put both numbers on here, but 28 degrees Fahrenheit, you're going to see temperatures of people that are wet aging. I would argue 39 is probably a little high. We like no more than 35 degrees. In a perfect world, 32 frozen from a water standpoint, but not from a meat standpoint, is really good. If you're going to do this, you have to rotate. If some of you are doing some of this and you're holding products for customers, you have to check for leakers. If you hold product and you have a leaker and you're wet aging this, and 30 days later you come back and check that product, you have a spoiled bag that you're going to throw away, and you're going to be angry because you're going to have $120, $130, $140 rib that you've had, or $150, $180 rib that you're going to have to throw away because it's spoiled. Big plants that hold products like this routinely send folks into the coolers to check these things. We do it too, because I lose my mind if we have leakers. Dry aging. Same temperature range, maybe a little bit bigger. Everybody has an opinion on this. Has to be below 40. Has to be below 40. 75 to 80% humidity is probably what most people are using. And they like a system that has a uniform airflow. Some people will achieve that by simple fans. Some people will achieve it by complex fans. Some people will achieve it by moving and rotating the product. This is a passion project. People that do this and do this well, it is every bit as much of an art as it is a science. If you're interested in this, you can look up anything that Dr. Phil Bass has put out. Dr. Bass worked for Certified Angus Beef for a long time, and now he's at the University of Idaho, and he works in this area a lot and is an expert in dry aging. How many days? So for dry aging, 14 to 35 is very, very common. 21 days probably minimum for what most people want to get. If you go a lot longer than that, you're going to suffer on the yield. So it's dehydrating. The surface is desiccating. Many of you have seen dry aging cabinets. If you go to a local restaurant, they're very popular again. We have a set of dry aging cabinets that we just got installed from Italy. I'm not sure if I should have bought the Italian ones, but that's a whole different story. So far, we've had our first batch out of there. We liked it. They ran pretty well, and then they stopped running. So we need to figure out exactly what caused that. Flavor and tenderness improves. You do need to keep these clean. There's a thought process because you have a very musty smell that these things are never cleaned. That is absolutely not the case. You do clean these routinely. And you also use a UV light, or sometimes people will use a UV light because any wild molds that get in there, sometimes they'll grow excessively on the surface. So that piece on the left is a fresh piece. That piece on the right has been there a while. This is actually kind of a bad example because in one of my slides, I'm going to say, don't ever age these. I think these are boneless. And boneless products, dry age rather, I should say, take a lot of trim loss. And so usually anything that we put in a dry aging cabinet, we put all the fat on it and we leave all the bone on it. So the stuff we dry aged the other day was bone-in strip loins and full ribs that had all the fat on it so that we can sacrifice that fat after the fact. So there's the next slide, bone-in. So those are bone-in strip loins that are sitting there on that table. And so that when you pull off that bone and you pull off that fat, then you've got the product underneath. Commodity trim, if you can get it, so leave all the fat on it. So why is this important? If you wanted to do some dry aging for some of your customers, or they wanted it, you would tell that to the processor and we would pull those ribs and we wouldn't trim any fat off them at all. We wouldn't pull the bones off of them. You will have to sacrifice the bones. You're not going to be able to save those bones because they're going to be so desiccated that you won't be able to use them. But they protect that product when you're dry aging. So no boneless for dry aging. That does not work. Some people do top sirloins. You're going to take a significant trim loss, but you know, some people have customers that want that, and so they do it. If you ever get an opportunity to go to a plant, I've been to a lot of these plants. Some of them are amazingly sophisticated. Others are as simple as a Costco shelf there to the right and a cooler. And there's everything in between. We have people that are building new versions of this, trying to duplicate the old ones. This is, you know, very opinion driven right now because there's not a lot of science on it, but it's fun. We bought a dry aging cabinet similar to, actually the picture on the right is one of our research cabinets that we just built, which is essentially just a pop cooler with a humidifier in there and a way to measure the humidity and a little bit of water and some fans. It works okay. If you can look at the kind of the left, if you will, or every other one, you can see those kind of dark dry aged pieces there, and on the right were the new ones that were put in. The new ones that we have are a little bit fancier. They have some computer controlled, and they look a little nicer on the left, and that's kind of the new style that we have. So why do we do all this? Well, we do all this because we're measuring tenderness, and tenderness is an important factor. And so just as a reminder, a lot of times you'll hear people talk about Warner Brasser shear force. If you spend any time at the university as a grad student, you ate a lot of those steaks on the right. Those are steaks where we took a sample out of them and we ran it on this machine and we measured the force that it takes to cut through that. And these are good tools to measure tenderness. Now, it's not something that necessarily you need to do or want to do as far as measuring tenderness, but we do have some people whose business has grown up so much that they want to actually categorize or characterize rather their products. We have some Wagyu folks these days that are asking that question. And so we do a lot of tenderness work for them. And again, the reason that we do this is it helps us remind everybody that when you have a lot of marbling, so slightly abundant and higher is prime, small to moderate is choice, and select, it's going to take more force to cut through those samples that have less marbling than it is the ones that have more marbling. And so 2.7 to 4.1 kilograms is a big difference. This is a good eating experience over here. And I think we got maybe one more slide that reminds us of that. Now maybe we lost it. This is a good eating experience over here, a very highly satisfied eating experience. This one, if you didn't cook it right, this isn't going to be quite the eating experience, and it's because of that marbling. So it's just something to think about. There's no difference between tenderness and wet and dry aging, none. I don't care what anybody says to you, there's no difference. Can you dry age grass-fed beef? You can, but you got to be really, really careful. You cannot dry age grass-fed beef for 21 days. You'll take such a yield loss that you won't be happy with the end product. But you could probably get away with dry aging those products for, 11 or 12 or 14 days. So we were really careful when we would dry age. Grass-fed was mostly accidentally dry aging because we need to have time to fabricate, but you got to be careful about how long you spend on that. All right, we're going to squip through a couple of things here. Okay, why do we do this dry aging? You get more pronounced flavor development, and you get a more wide range of flavors, an earthy, nutty, rich flavor. And people like that. And so some customers are all about this. A lot of this flavor has just been concentrated because we pulled the moisture out, and they enjoy this. Some folks over there don't like that flavor, and so they're happy with traditional wet age product. You don't get a lot of flavor changes on wet age product. In fact, when you hold the product in a bag, if you don't do it right, you can get a little bit of a negative odor associated with it. So when that came out, we had to kind of educate our customers. Just something to think about as you're going through your system and trying to figure out what you might want to do. All right, I want to make sure that we leave enough time. So we got about right at 20 minutes. Anything that else that you'd like questions have about, or anything else that we want to cover? And if a couple of those slides were interested people, we can absolutely talk about them.
All right, Bob. We got some good ones here.
If they involve why I have this haircut, I can't answer that.
Your haircut?
Yeah, one time the students on their review said you actually pay for that haircut. I said, well, that's a little bit brutal, guys, but
it looks economical.
There you go. That was political.
If you grind, Tony has some great questions tonight. If you grind a higher proportion of a carcass, do you get better value because you use more of the total fat from the animal?
Tony. Yeah. So maybe, as long as you're not over your fat target. So the real question is, when we make ground beef, and we do ground beef the old school way, which is we're cutting a beef, we've got people at the table, and we're dropping this into the container, and we're doing it visually. We don't do that at the big plants, but we do that at the small plants because I don't have any other methodology to start with. The small plants do have the ability to test with some simple testing devices, but it's, you make it, you grind it, you sample it, and then you say, oh, doggone, that was supposed to be 20%, and that stuff's only 15%. Okay, I'm going to chuck back in some more fat. It's a little hard to do. So I think the question that you're asking is, if we're grinding a lot of it, then am I taking a lot of the fat that's on the chuck and a lot of the fat that's on the round, and am I including that? If you do a good job and you don't shoot past the 20% that you want, that's a good idea. If your customer wants 30%, that's a great idea. What's the maximum fat that we can have in ground beef? Everybody knows it's 30%. So you can't just make 35% fat ground beef. You can't do that in this country. Even though there's probably some people that would love the heck out of it. You can't do that and call it ground beef. So good question. I will tell you that most of the time when people are making ground beef, they undershoot, and they actually are leaner than they think they are. Because when you look at that fat against the lean in that lug, people see the white, it sticks out to them. And so they're like, oh my goodness, kids do it all the time. And then we go test that ground beef and it's 17%, it's 15%. And it's not going to eat as good as 20%.
Yeah.
Good question.
It is a great question. And also related to that, next week, Matt LaRue of Cornell University is going to be talking about how to use a pricing calculator, a meat calculator that he developed. And unless you're getting the right price for your grind, it may be better to leave that stuff in the form of other cuts. So we're actually going to look at how to price out a carcass and how we can make some shifts in pricing to get a maximum value for that animal. And if you don't have a great ground beef market or can't get a good price for it, it sometimes makes sense to leave that material in
And
different
and I
cuts.
haven't even seen the material that they're going to present, but they're going to talk about the same idea as the cutout. They may call it yield or carcass yield or fabrication yield, but the principle is exactly the same. And you've got to have that, because if you do not understand what you have in your pricing, it's going to hurt. And one time you're going to make, 20, 30, 40, 50, pick a number. And the next time you're going to be in the red $200 and you're going to be losing your mind.
Mm-hmm. How long are primals typically wet aged?
Yeah, I neglected. I think I got a little heavy-handed and deleted out the wet age slide. So thank you for mentioning that. Commercially, on products that are vacuum packaged, bone-in products, we would typically say they've got a shelf life of 21 days, and boneless products a shelf life of 28 days. That's fresh. Those are the minimum numbers. If your packaging is very good, we can hold boneless products 70, 80, 90, 100 days because we do that routinely when we export. So the answer to the question is 28 seems to be, or 21 to 28 is a really good number that people like for wet aging. A minimum of 14 days. 11 to 14 is where people will say, the research says that the majority, not all of the aging, but the majority of the aging is complete. Depends on who you believe. There was a student that I went to school with, his data said 11, some other people said 14. So a lot of people like 21 as a good round number. Seems to work pretty well. What you don't want to do is have product that's 2, 3, 4, 5 days post-mortem to a customer. And that's where you'll get customers that are very unhappy. We need to age products because those tough beef, and Jen probably talked about it, that number one thing on beef is tenderness. They cannot stand tough beef in this country. Now, again, we could argue about whether we're spoiled, and we are, but tenderness is a big deal. 21 days in the bag.
You know,
I have a friend who ages for restaurants. They do 100 days in a bag. I think that's insane, but that's what they like.
You know, I've toured a lot of small plants, and I'm sure you have too. And I've seen most of them just do dry aging. I have never seen any that actually even had the vacuum sealers that could do whole primals in them. Is that something that you've seen in small plants?
Yeah, because sometimes we do a combination. So there's some really smart men and women out there that are running these plants, and they don't want to dry age the parts that doesn't add a lot of value to dry age. So what they'll do is they'll cut the loin and they'll drop it in a bag. And so for strip loins, doesn't take a lot of space. They'll take the rib, because remember, wet aging. They'll put it in a bag and they'll wet age the strip loin. They'll wet age the rib. And then they'll fabricate the rest of the carcass. And the reason that some folks are doing that is because they want to move through their system, but their customers want that product aged. So everybody has a different style. I mean, in the old days, yes, the coolers would be full, especially in the small plants, and everything was dry aged. But everybody has a little different system that they follow. I will be 100% honest. At the university, everything is over dry aged because we're always behind. Not a very sophisticated marketing plan.
Well, I would say that unless you're marketing to like grocery stores or I guess even restaurants, that most of the time wet aging is just not going to be a thing that you do a whole lot of because you'll probably be working with a small co-packer. They'll probably do like a 14-day dry age, and that'll be pretty much your only option. And if you do sell to restaurants that want to further age, a lot of them do their own on-site aging of the loins and stuff. So you don't have to do that as the farmer, right?
No, you're 100% right. And, it's just that it's a good thing to be aware of. The other thing is that you need to market that. I'll be honest, we do a bad job of marketing the fact that we dry age a lot of product.
Yeah.
But you do take a yield loss on that. And that's important when you're talking to this gentleman next week. When you're talking about your yield, your yields are always going to be different than the yields that we're going to have in a commercial facility because you're going to take more trim loss associated with dry aging. And that's okay. That's part of the process. That's part of the business, if you will.
Definitely.
And do you have a couple other questions? Because I'll make one more comment.
I do.
Please.
From Good Hope Cattle, can you explain how irrigated pasture enhances marbling? How many days off irrigated pasture do you think would negatively affect Angus cattle?
Yeah, so I can't answer the second part of the question, but I can answer the first part of the question really easily. So animals lay down marbling last. They lay down fat from the front to the back and from the top of the animal to the bottom of the animal. And we only lay down marbling when we have excess energy, okay? That's why I'm scooting down a little bit here so you don't see my excess energy. We lay down that fat in cattle in the form of marbling. So when we had grass-fed animals in California and we're on not irrigated pasture, we're just on rangeland in an area where maybe we got 14 inches on the most amazing year ever. There, at the end of that, as we're heading into June, basically into end of June, those cattle are in a situation where they're scavenging for feed. They're not in an excess energy situation. So in some irrigated pastures, you've got really good feed available and really good genetics, meaning the animals are predisposed to lay down marbling. Yeah, that's how that works well. And that's why you have to be very careful to generalize that grass-fed, grass-finished will not have any marbling, because that's not accurate. There are people that have locations in this country with really good feedstuffs, and so that they can keep those animals, because the animal's still working for the feed. You're not cutting the feed and putting it in the bunk in front of them, but there's so much of it there that they can start to lay down a little bit. But I can't tell you, I'm not a nutritionist, I'm not good enough to tell you exactly what happens when you lose that, other than to tell you that if you pull away and an animal is in a situation where they're having to hustle for feed, that marbling is going to go right away out of the muscle. How fast?
Yeah.
I'd have to do a little check-in with my neighbors down the hall, and we could follow up on that. But you will lose marbling quickly if you start to run out of feed.
Yeah, and on that question, I would suggest revisiting Jim Garish from Idaho, his slide presentation. He was in the second class. He really stressed the fact that the last 60 to 90 days of the animal's life should be putting on about 2 pounds a day average daily weight gain. So I imagine if you took it off irrigated pasture for, more than a week or something, you're definitely going to see a reduction in those gains. And like Bob said, it's going to start pulling fat out of its muscle for energy needs. So you could negatively impact your marbling. Okay. From Tim. What share of margin comes from premium cuts? Is it worth it to sacrifice the short rib to make gigantic tomahawks? How should we think about that sort of cost-benefit analysis?
Okay, excellent question. So the tomahawk, that extra piece of the tomahawk is coming out of the plate. So in that case, if you could sell tomahawks, you're taking the part of the plate away that might be into short ribs, or more than likely is in the bone barrel. So the tomahawk, if you've got people that will buy that bone, figure out a way to package it and figure out a way to sell it. This is a short-lived novelty thing. Not everybody that's going to buy beef, and I don't mean any disrespect to that, because I think it's very clever. But anytime you can sell a bone, if your customer enjoys it, you should do it. So the number one most expensive cut in a beef animal is tenderloin. What is the most expensive cut in a pork carcass? It isn't tenderloin. It's back ribs, because the world loves to chew on bones and take the meat off of the bone. So we sell back ribs all the day long, more expensive than we do loin. I would rather eat a loin chop, cut a piece, but people would rather buy the bone. So if you can sell them the bone, if they're very interested, if your customer base is saying, hey, I want all my rib steaks bone in, cut them all day long. If they are all about T-bones and porterhouse, absolutely. Cut those all day long. Absolutely.
Hmm. And I will make the plug, like Bob mentioned, the beef checkoff and the pork checkoff have a lot of really great free information about what's hot in different markets, and also different parts of the country. Like if you live in California, you can sell tri-tip all day long. East Coast doesn't even know what tri-tip is. So you should really study those demographics of your region and what cuts are hot for your region. Would you agree to that, Bob?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that those websites are phenomenal for, and you could spend a year on the beef site and scratch the surface on that. They do, both of them do a good job of suggesting some alternative cuts. And maybe sometimes, depending on what your customer base is doing, maybe it's good to change it up. So there's a part of, when you fabricate pork, there's a piece of the picnic that we call the picnic heart or the cushion heart. And that is what people will sell as a pork tri-tip. Now, it isn't a tri-tip. It's not the same muscle as in a beef, but it's a nice little small muscle that you can grill up real easy and slice, and it's super tender. And oftentimes that'll just go into sausage. This is back to the gentleman's question. If he or she is getting 5, 6, whatever bucks a pound for that as sausage, if they're not getting the same price for it as the pork tri-tip, don't pull it out and take it away from the sausage. Keep it in the sausage. But if they're struggling a little bit and they want to try something else, then that's where you pull that one out and say, can I get a few more pennies for it in one form? And that's where that's really important. And you're 100% right to ask that question.
Yeah, and also grinding and making sausage usually costs more to the processor. So if you can save $1 on not making it into sausage, make $1.50 by keeping it in another cut. Keep it in that other cut. Unless like your business is based on sort of diversity of inventory, which we're going to talk a little bit about different market channels next week. But if you are like a farmer's market vendor and it's really key to have a diversity of inventory, you're going to want to make sure you have, that diversity and you wouldn't want to go into summer with no sausage, for example. Then you would probably, your customers would leave instantly. But that question about kind of making money from different cuts, we will touch on a bit with Matt LaRue and his meat calculator. And he's going to teach us how to use it so that we can all go home and play with it and take sort of an average animal, knowing an average yield on an average animal, and plug it into his calculator, and then just start playing with the pricing on different cuts and seeing how we can make our profit goals on an animal. So that should be fun. Tony asks, can you dry age the whole carcass 14 days, then put a subprimal strip loin in a bag and ship it somewhere, wet aging for 14 more days?
Yep. Absolutely, you can. The only thing you have to be a little bit careful of is as long as you have a good cold chain system. So if you don't have a good cold chain system, or you haven't treated that product with respect, then you'll have a problem. But the answer is yes, you can do that. I'm not exactly sure that I could come up with a scenario of why you would do that, but you can. But what you can't do is take product that is marginal, that is very heavily aged and not taken care of well in temperature, and put it in a bag and expect that bag to be magic. And that's what we have to teach some of our students here. It's not a magic bag. If you put some product in there that's marginal and try to think that that's going to stretch it somehow and make it last 3 more weeks, that isn't going to happen.
I do have a question for you, Bob. With some of these more novel, interesting cuts like that, what was that pork cut that you said from the picnic?
Oh,
What's it
yeah, the
called
pork
again?
tri-tip.
So some of these more novel cuts, those names aren't necessarily recognized yet by FSIS labeling division, right?
Well, that's true. But, they're pretty liberal on, see, I don't know how detailed you guys went into. Oh, wrong pipe, sorry. I don't know. Excuse me. They're pretty liberal on use of generic labeling changes for those. And in theory, they're not, with a few exceptions, calling something a ranch steak or a, can't remember the other steak that we used a name in there, you know, a his and her steak, they're not going to get too upset with those. Where you will get in trouble with USDA is if you were lying about where it originated from. So if we started labeling something beef chuck T-bone steak, they'd say, whoa, 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 whoa. The T-bone steak historically comes from the loin. I can't think of anything out of the chuck that would be similar to that. But if you said a beef chuck ranch steak or a beef chuck barbecue steak, they would probably be okay with that. Labeling is difficult, as you know. Usually what people do is they have a label approved, and then they do internal generic approvals for all the rest of the labeling. And then this is something we can follow up with a little bit more on the IRMIS website, which I'll be real candid, I'm a little bit behind on. They've done a good job of updating that. In 2014, I think, was the last big update on that. So there's a lot of examples on that. Labeling is a really tough one. The only thing that I'll say on the labeling is try to follow the tenet of species, wholesale cut, subprimal, you know, bone, etc. So you're telling the customer where it's coming from. If you're saying something's from the loin, it has to be from the loin. We can't be dishonest and say, you know, the top round is from the loin. That's not accurate.
Okay, that's good to know. Tim asked, do you have a recommendation for a dry aging cabinet?
I recommend, yeah. So here's what I recommend. If you're going to make one, if you're going to do it, I think you just make one right now. I wouldn't spend the money. You know, I'm not bashing the guy that we bought it from. It's too expensive. But I would get online, and there are lots of local folks that are making good dry aging cabinets out of pop coolers. I mean, seriously, true brand double door cooler with either glass doors or stainless steel doors that you can clean the inside. There's some different groups, and we can probably find a couple of those where they're retrofitting them for you. But it's not hard. It's controlling the humidity. So you're basically putting something in there. You're putting a humidifier. We've done it sometimes where we put the humidifier, we just set it in there, and then we have a very simple meter that we buy off the internet for a couple of bucks that reads the humidity. You don't want it at 100% humidity. You know, you want it at, you know, 78% is probably a good number, and 35, you know, degrees, you could do pretty well. I'd just be careful about buying a really robust system that's fancy and it's got lots of bells and whistles until you see a reason for it. Because you can dry age, if you have a walk-in cooler, you can dry age in that thing tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, most restaurants that I've seen doing their own aging program, it was just their typical walk-in cooler with not a lot of technology, maybe a thermometer and a humidity sensor, you know.
I mean, those are the two, you know, things. A lot of them have glass because, you know, it's, you know, what they want.
They want to see it, yeah.
You need to hang it, you know, everything in there needs to be stainless steel, or you can hang the products with cotton twine. We do that, that's fine. But you wouldn't use any wood in there. You'd use screens as opposed to flat trays, because you want the airflow. We're still waiting for one part of our new system. And so we had some flat areas, and that caused a little bit of loss on the bottom of that because we didn't get enough airflow. So screens, stainless steel, or you can hang the product, a little fan to move the air around, something to monitor humidity. There's a company, you know, I'm not pitching this, but there's a company called ThermalWorks. They sell a ton of these little meters to read everything, barbecue thermometers, all this kind of stuff that you can hook up to your phone, stuff that you can, you know, see, and you just keep an eye on it. What you don't want to do is keep doing this. You don't want to keep opening the door, right? It's like if you have a, you know, humidor, you know, you're into cigars or something, you can't keep opening the lid. You gotta keep it closed, which is why the glass is nice. Or you can just buy the meter that's got a probe that goes in. You just close the door on the wire, and it works great.
My last question for you, Bob, is in your role at CSU, are you available for consultation directly with processors or producers that are looking to maybe change up their cutting programs or what have you?
Yeah, so right or wrong, CSU doesn't have an extension person in the meats group.
Okay.
I throw that out for a little political statement. I don't know why we don't, but
Yep.
I probably shouldn't have said that on the tape. But anyway, the answer is yes. We take calls all the time. Anybody that calls or reaches out to us, we're absolutely happy to talk with them. The other thing we're happy to do is anybody that wants to come to the university and see what we have. We had a gentleman here the other day from, I can't remember exactly where on the Western Slope, and he built a small little poultry facility. He wanted to see what we had here. I said, of course, you're welcome to come out. We don't have any secrets at the university. We're happy to help. And so there's 3 meat scientists on faculty. You've heard from Dr. Martin, and then we have Mahesh Nair, who's a muscle biologist. We're all happy to take emails and calls, and we do it all the time.
Awesome. That's great. And maybe someday you'll have an extension program. Do you do HACCP courses or short courses at all?
We do a lot. We also partner with a lot of industry companies, but yes, and if there's a need for for HACCP courses, we're happy to do them. We've tried a couple of times on the Western Slope, and we just haven't had the critical mass to put those together. But we're happy to do that. What we won't do, with all respect, is hand folks HACCP plans to cut and paste. We don't think that's the best approach. I will agree that fresh meat HACCP plan is fairly straightforward, but every single plant and every single process is unique. And so to do right by that system, we need to take a little bit of due diligence to make sure that what a particular company is doing is not substantially different that's going to cause them trouble. But we answer questions all the time, food safety questions. Happy to do it.
Awesome. Well, I think that we've taken up enough of your time, Bob. We will definitely make sure we get your contact information out to the group. This has been just probably the most wealth of information of any of our talks so far. Thank you so much. And I think Martha can close it out, but I've had a great night and learned a ton.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And we'll see you next week. And we will get this recording to you as quickly as possible, because as Rebecca said, there's so much information here. You're going to want to rewatch it. So it'll go viral. Good night, everybody.